All right, cool. All right, good morning. So I'm also going to run out of time because 10 minutes is very difficult. But anyway, so this is part of a big project that we had here in you guys' backyard on the Mississippi. I want to highlight the work of my two grad students, Evan Majette and Anthony Beaver. We're actually trying to graduate now, so they're looking for opportunities if you guys are open. These guys have produced tremendous amount of work, as well as Anna Britzkamp, who is here and has a poster tonight, and Eva Ferreira, part of Christophe Rabou's group, and Jordan's Beckler group that helped us along the way. We just did 5 cruises on the Mississippi Delta in 2 years, so that was a lot of work. We have 12 stations, as you will see. That's a lot of data. So I'm not going to show you any data today. I'm going to try to do that. Okay, so I pushed this idea to NSF by saying that these environments are great proxies for climate change because they're exposed to significant river inputs, right? When you're going to raise temperature on land, will increase precipitation, so we should increase the discharge, right? So that should be a proxy for what would happen in the coastal environment. At the same time, obviously, the uptake of CO2 from the atmosphere, we generate, at least in the beginning, tremendous primary production that results in a huge flux to the seafloor. Hence, again, these deltaic environments, proxies for these processes for a normal coastal environment. So I pushed that up, and the questions that we're trying to answer is basically, what's the impact of the river discharge on the benthic respiration processes, and also on the acidification of the overlying waters? As Bob just described, the recycling of carbon in these environments generates significant amount of flux of DIC to the overlying waters. So, like I mentioned, 12 station, we did a transect along the shelf, the hypoxic shelf, transect across the slope south of the Southwest Pass, and then also a small transect the southeast side of the Bird's Foot across the slope. We did that for 5 cruises from fall 2020 to summer 22. As you can see on this similar slide that Bob showed for the Amazon, the discharge varies significantly on the shelf. Obviously, it's cyclical every year, but important variations can obviously see here for the freshets during the spring relative to the summer, and also some variations we'll talk about for the July 21 cruise, where the discharge is actually above the threshold, the critical discharge threshold, where the sediment resuspension in the river increased the supply to the shelf tremendously. And so during these cruises, we deployed 2 benthic landers, one for the shelf that's tethered to the surface. We lost one. Question, it's still in, I don't know where it is. It's still in the Gulf if you see it sometime. And then this one, that's the free benthic lander from Rick Yankee that we've been using for the last 10 years or so for the slope work. And I'm not going to show you data. These landers basically collect benthic chamber samples so we can measure fluxes. And then also have a profiler with voltammetric electrodes to measure the redox profiles in the sediments, measure oxygen, manganese, iron, sulfide. Okay, so I'll lie, I said I'm not going to show you data, but this is the type of data we'll generate. This is for one station, one set of benthic flux measurement, pore waters from cores, and then the electrochemical data. Also, this is 4 stations during 3 cruises, but a lot of data. And look at these profiles, a pretty beautiful data set that I'm looking forward to share with you guys at one point. Okay, so what I want to show you is what we think we witnessed from these 5 cruises in these 4 regions, basically over the course of the study. And so we're going to start with the proximal shelf in the spring. So obviously the river deposition of organic materials and minerals to the shelf controls the biogeochemistry in the sediments. We have tremendous flux of DIC and alkalinity coming out of from these systems simply because the organic matter is so active that the respiration process are mainly anaerobic in those systems pretty much year-long in the summer and the fall. We also see a tremendous benthic flux of ammonium and phosphate, as Bob just mentioned. The other thing that we also see, interestingly, is sometimes the alkalinity decreases a little bit during the summer as a result of this perturbation, probably these mobile mods, resuspension events that basically transported across to the slope. So decreasing, basically increasing the oxygen consumption and reoxidizing metabolites that decrease the flux of the alkalinity. So ratios of alkalinity to DIC flux that are relatively high, but sometimes modulated during the summer, during these storms. Again, in the fall, the fluxes don't change significantly, which was interesting to us, probably because of these deposits. These fluxes of organic input of organic carbons are huge in the system. On the distal shelf, obviously a little bit further away, the benthic flux, generally speaking, are lower across the seasons, not significantly different, but the difference we saw was basically location. On the western shelf, the fluxes are sustained. On the southwest shelf, we're close to the slope, the benthic flux decreases, and also the type of system, the type of respiration process involved is mostly aerobic, with a lot of reoxidation of reduced metabolites near the interface, such that the DIC exceed the alkalinity flux out of these sediments at these regions. And then also the effect of these mobile mud transport that basically consumes alkalinity by reoxidizing these reduced metabolites during the summer. Again, on the southwest side, there's not much changes in the overall seasonality of these processes, probably because we think that the southwest shelf, basically the sediment is passing by, if you want, is being transported to the slope and doesn't really stay too long in that environment. When we go to the hypoxic shelf, obviously pretty tremendous primary production in the shelf, but we didn't see it everywhere. So there's some region on the shelf that we call the hypoxic shelf, the zone that's exposed to hypoxic conditions along the shelf that are basically not exposed to high primary production. Obviously, in the spring already, we see huge DIC flux across the sediment water interface in the zone of high primary production, whereas the sediment is mostly aerobic, so very little alkalinity generated in those sediments relative to the proximal and the distal domain. And then obviously during the summer, when oxygen is depleted in the water column, and as we think about, Christophe and I talking about all the time, we think that the benthic flux here is really driving the consumption of oxygen during this early spring and late spring and early summer. And then after that, maybe some oxygen respiration occurs in the water column later on during the summer. But we think the benthic flux of oxygen here is probably the driver of the establishment of the hypoxic zone in that system. And so during the summer, when the system is hypoxic, now we have a system dominated by manganese iron reduction and also sulfate reduction, such that the benthic alkalinity flux is reestablished and basically mitigating the acidification that we see during the spring. Now, interestingly, the carbon must be so labeled during the summer that in the fall, the respiration rates decrease tremendously in both environments. So indicating that really that these seasonal variations have to be considered when we're looking at these processes overall. Okay, and then finally on the slope, how much should I do? Wow, that's crazy. Okay. On the slope, so obviously we see this mass wasting process, right? The sediment reach the slope. We actually don't see seasonal variations in those benthic flux of DIC and alkalinity. What we see is that the alkalinity is actually much higher than we thought previously. It's because the sediment is mostly aerobic with a little bit of manganese and iron reduction. So we think that calcium carbonate dissolution is actually responsible for the increased benthic flux of alkalinity that we measure along the slope. So my student, Evan Majet, has got a poster here if you guys are interested in talking to him about it today. Okay, so I want to switch my second point. I have a minute left, I guess. So we know that the surface area of the hypoxic zone varies tremendously over the years. And this is data from July 21 from Rabelais group, and then data from July 22. During our cruises, and I highlighted the box where the zone of the area that we study. And we see this in our data set. So bottom water oxygen concentration with the dashed line, the overlying water concentration in July 21, relatively high, almost as high as in April. But in July 22, when the hypoxic zone is really closer to the Mississippi, we see much lower oxygen concentration. So everything makes sense. We see the oxygen penetration depth that's much higher in July 21, almost as high as in April, but much lower, much higher than during the July 22. The sediment oxidizing capacity, which gives you that balance of how much oxygen is consumed versus how much reduced terminal electron acceptors are produced, basically shows that the sediment is oxidized in July 21, but not in July 22. So of course, in July 21, the hypoxic zone was not so close to the Mississippi, it was much westerner to the Texan shelf. And so the question is what controlled this extent of the hypoxic zone? And so not spending any time since I don't have time, but this is showing the mean discharge between 2009 and 2020, and then with highlighting 21 and 22, or 21 in the light blue and 22 in the dark blue. As you can see, right before our sampling, which turned out to be exactly the same time in 21 and 22, we have dramatic difference in the discharge at these two systems that basically controls the redox processes, and also sedimentation, the cumulative suspended sediment load that we calculated from the river that shows that it's much lower in 21 and 22 compared to 21, almost as high in 21, summer 21 than the April 22. That probably controls all the spreading of the nutrients to the shelf to increase primary production on the western side of the shelf, and then the accumulation of sediments near the shore in 22 that basically generate all these transformation of carbon in the sediment. Okay, I'll stop here.